Gonzaga's tune-up exhibition game against Warner Pacific had some eye-popping stats, but is there much to learn about this team from this performance?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Thursday, happy Halloween, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, Gonzaga took care of business in an exhibition game against Warner Pacific. 109-52 was the final score. We'll talk about that contest, some of the stats, a little bit of the keys to the game that we talked about on an earlier episode, what we saw, what we didn't see in this game. And then we're actually going to move on and do our Nolan Hickman player preview episode. We kind of condensed it into just two segments. It was good timing as Nolan had a fantastic game here against the Knights of Warner Pacific. So we'll get to that as well. So the main thing about this game, unfortunately, was that it was hard to watch. Not hard to watch as in the actual on the court game was difficult. It was literally not easy for people to watch it unless you lived in the Spokane market. The game was on KHQ in Spokane, but it was not on Root. It was not on ESPN Plus. This is something that I'm hoping will not be a continual issue for Gonzaga this season. Need to find a way to make sure that fans in the Portland and Seattle market, which are huge pockets of Gonzaga fans, are not blacked out of ESPN games and also blacked out of KHQ games and therefore just hung out to dry and unable to watch the team. I'm hoping that they will find a workaround, find some kind of resolution to this. I don't have any information on it. I'm sorry. I'm hoping that when I do, or if I hear anything, we'll be able to talk about it and we'll figure out what we want to do and how we want to make sure we can watch those games. But it might have just been because it was an exhibition game. Hopefully it's not a recurring thing going forward. Starting lineup for Gonzaga in this game: Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Caleb Battle, Braden, Huff, and Graham Ike. I'm not reading into the starting lineups. The starting lineup in the scrimmage game against USC had Caleb Battle instead of Nolan Hickman. He was coming off the bench in this game. The Zags had both Michael Ajayi and Ben Gregg coming off the bench. I think there's an element of Mark Few trying to experiment. I think in this case, maybe see how that two big lineup with Huff and Ike playing together looked. I think it's also an aspect of trying to prevent the Scott Drew and the Baylor staff from learning exactly what Gonzaga's plan is coming into the season. And so mixing and matching and doing things maybe a little differently than the plan for the start of the season. I don't know. That's a guess there, but it seems plausible that that would be the strategy here in a contest like this. Gonzaga also did some substitution patterns that we're not going to see in the season. We saw Smiley Diani playing more minutes early in the game than I think we're probably not going to see in the season. Joe Few played in the first half, not something we're going to see in the season as well. Just trying some new stuff, experimenting with some things, giving some other guys some opportunities in games that don't actually count in the standings. Bit of a rough start for Gonzaga, and then it just got ludicrous. It just got ludicrous after that. It was 22-19. And after it was 22-19, Gonzaga closed the half on a 42-8 run. 42-8. And then Gonzaga started the second half on a 17-0 run, which means they went on a 59-8 run. Just ridiculous stuff. Yes, obviously it's an NAIA opponent. We know that. We know that this is a opponent that is not nearly on the quality of Gonzaga or other D1 opponents. This team is much like teams like Santa Clara and Pacific and teams like that in the WCC are much, much closer to Gonzaga than this team. They're just way below that level. And so sure, you kind of take a lot of the results with a grain of salt, but 59-8 run is just absurd anyway. It's absolutely insane. Nolan Hickman was fantastic in this one, 19 points, 8 of 13 from the field, did almost all of his damage in the first half. Gonzaga also, part of the catalyst for that deep run was they had 15 steals in the first half alone. 15 steals in the first half, 19 on the game. They were basically just able to get the basketball whenever they wanted. 4 of those steals from Dusty Stromer, 3 from Ben Gregg and Graham Ike, 2 each from Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, and Emmanuel Innocente. Ryan Nembhard, 7.7 assists at halftime. We had 5 things we were looking for coming into the game, so we're going to talk about each of those here quickly, and then we'll get into our Nolan Hickman season preview episode. Key number 1 was, can the front court players bounce back offensively? Yes, we saw that. Graham Ike finished this game with 11 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, 5 of 8 from the field. He knocked down a 3-pointer too, just for good measure. Why not, right? Braden Huff looked much better in this game, 14 points, 5 rebounds, 5 of 8 from the field. He was 3 of 4 at halftime, knocked down his free throws as well. Always good to see him, a player who was like 50-something% last year. It's good to see him contribute more in that spot. Ben Gregg was a little bit rough, 3 of 8 from the field. He was 2 of 6 in the first half. He did finish with 8 points and 11 rebounds. He also had 3 assists and 3 steals, doing the dirty work, doing the stuff that you need him to do, but was a little bit of a slow start for him. And when you look at that compared to the USC exhibition, I'm sure some folks are going to be a little bit concerned. I'm not overly worried about Ben. He's been in this system for a really long time. I don't think that there's much concern here, but it is something to keep an eye on if he gets off to a slow start this season. If maybe he's not feeling well, who knows what the situation is there, but still finished this game, a bucket away from a double-double in a relatively short amount of playing time. So I can't really complain there. Key number 2 was about protecting the rim, and it wasn't really a factor. Gonzaga finished with 5 blocks in the game. Obviously, there's more to protecting the rim than just block shots, but there wasn't any in the first half because Warner Pacific only took 11 shots in the first half on twos. Basically all of their field goal attempts were from 3. They were just trying to bomb threes. They weren't getting open looks. They weren't able to get past the perimeter players, so they couldn't get to the rim. They only made 4 of their 11 two-point attempts in the first half, didn't do much better in the second half either. So yeah, not really much to glean from that there. Number 3 was talking about Stromer and Innocente and how they looked defensively, and both looked great. Really good game from Dusty Stromer. He wasn't super efficient scoring the basketball. He's 2 of 5 from threes, of 40%, 0 of 1 on twos, did not attempt any shot, only attempted 1 shot inside the 2-point line in this one, but 5 points. Finished with 8 points, 4 boards, 4 assists, and 4 steals. Love that stat line for Dusty Stromer in 27 minutes. A huge chunk of them coming in the second half. And then he was part of that lineup that went on that massive run. He had almost all of his turnovers that he forced were in like this 4-minute span when Gonzaga blew this thing wide open. He was on the floor during a massive run with Nembhard, Hickman, Ajayi, and Ike. And I think there's a good chance that that's a lineup we see quite a bit of. Now, Battle was off the floor for large chunks of the first half because he committed 3 fouls very early. When Battle's not in foul trouble, he's obviously going to play a lot. But the Nembhard, Hickman, Stromer, Ajayi, Ike lineup, I like that a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see quite a bit of that this season. Innocente also had a quality game. I posted this on Twitter for those of you who saw it. Plus minus is a useless stat in a 1-game sample. It's an even more useless stat in a half-game sample. But in 6 minutes in the first half, Emmanuel Innocente had a plus minus of plus 19. That's just ridiculous. 2 points, 5 boards, 4 assists, 2 steals, and a block for him. I've kind of made this joke before. Emmanuel Innocente is the guy you want on your college basketball fantasy team because he's going to get you a few stats in every category, and that's what he did here in this one. Wanted to see what we saw from wanted to see Jun Suk-Yo and wanted to see if he would kind of look like somebody who could be more of a rotation player in this game. 7 points for him, 3 of 5 from the field, 1 of 2 from distance, had 4 boards and a block in 12 minutes as well. And then, of course, for games like this, you always want to see the walk-ons. Joe Few played 8 minutes, had 2 points from the free throw line, also had an assist and a steal. Noah Holland got his first points in a Gonzaga basketball uniform. We were hoping to see him in this game as one of his teammates from Allen Hancock Junior College was playing for Warner Pacific, so it was nice to see him not only get in the game, but score a bucket and grab a rebound as well. Joaquin Reyes-Moore, who was on the team last year but redshirted, got an assist in 2 minutes of action. We did not see Graydon Lemke or Cade or Ness, but good to see Q get an assist, good to see Holland get a bucket, and of course Joe Few getting on the floor as well. Folks, we're going to move on now. We're going to talk about Nolan Hickman's player preview episode, his best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season. All that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about FanDuel. We got college hoops action coming up with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you placed your bets. And Gonzaga opens the season 3.5-point favorites against Baylor. We finally have in-season lines coming your way. I like the Zags to cover that. If you are with me, visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Moving away from talking about the exhibition game against Warner Pacific to instead do a condensed version of our Nolan Hickman season preview episode. Typically, for those of you who've been listening to the show the last few weeks, you know we do the players' history, how they ended up here in Spokane, getting ready for the season, and then we do their best and worst case scenarios, and then we close out the show talking about expected role, expected production, and then their future. We're going to skip the history part for Nolan Hickman. He's been in the system for a long time. Most of you are familiar with Nolan Hickman. Started out as a bench player, starting point guard his sophomore year. Last year was a starting 2 guard as Ryan Nembhard came in, has kind of played a different role each of his years in Spokane, has improved every single season he's been in Spokane as well. Last year, career high 14 points per game, shot over 41% from 3. And the best case scenario for Nolan Hickman this year is effectively that he continues to improve. His points per game have gone up. His rebounding numbers have gone up. His 3-point percentage has gone up. We've continued to see him be a more, and just not even statistically, as eye test, watching him, you can tell he has gotten more comfortable in Gonzaga's system. He's gotten more confidence. And the best case scenario is that that continues. Nolan Hickman's going to be a big part of Gonzaga's team offensively, particularly as a 3-point shooter. Especially with Steel Venters not being in the mix for this year, Gonzaga's 3-point shooting is, I don't want to say it's a concern. I think it's going to end up being good this year, but Nolan Hickman needs to be good for that to be something that is a strength for this Gonzaga team. As a freshman, Hickman shot 31% from 3. As a sophomore, he shot 35.5% from 3. As a junior, he shot 41% from 3. The best case scenario is pretty simple. Shoots 45% from 3. Continues the evolution of shooting 5+ percentage points better from 3. I mean, really the best case scenario is 46, 47, something like that from 3. I think pushing 40. He took nearly 9 3-point attempts per game last year. If he shoots 46% on 9 3-point attempts per game, he's going to be one of the most prolific volume 3-point shooters in the country. That's the best case scenario, is he is that level of 3-point shooter and dynamic, versatile floor spacer for this team. The best case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that he remains a clutch outside shooter and a steady presence on this team. Nolan Hickman did not thrive as the team's starting point guard his sophomore year. Everybody knows that. People really liked to complain about Nolan Hickman's performance as the team's point guard as a sophomore. But he really shone through last year in that off-ball, secondary ball handler role. And when he was tasked with handling point guard duties, whether it was when Ryan Nembhard was on the bench, which was incredibly infrequently last year, or just in situations where Nembhard wasn't shooting well and they needed Hickman to run the pick and roll because it was – when Nembhard was running it, they were just able to go under on those screens and dare him to shoot. We saw Hickman handle that responsibility very well. Best case scenario for this year is that he is that calming presence. He is somebody you can rely on. He's not going to be turnover prone. He's not going to get sped up. He can be that secondary ball handler, another creator. He can get downhill and score. He can distribute the basketball. He can avoid those turnovers and do what you need him to do in this offense because he's the most familiar player with this system on the roster. The best case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that just like he adjusted extremely well to playing alongside Ryan Nembhard last year, he does the same this year with Caleb Battle. And in the exhibition game against USC, the two of them had a really fantastic play that I want to highlight. Caleb Battle came up to set a screen. It was a slip screen of sorts. Hickman made a quick little bounce pass between the two defenders. Battle caught it. It caught the defenders in a spot where they weren't ready for him. He had a clear path downhill, drove to the basket. I think he ended up dumping it off to Ajayi for a dunk. But if they can run plays like that, where they can get Battle open going downhill, that is That's points pretty much every single time. It's either 2 at the free throw line, 1 at the free throw line, and 2 at the cup, or he's finishing, or he's dumping it off to somebody else for points. That's going to work. And if he can do that kind of stuff, that's really, really beneficial for the team. Obviously, for Hickman, it's not just adjusting to Battle. It's also adjusting to Ajayi and helping in that area as well. But I expect a lot of minutes where Hickman and Battle are playing together. And in a best case scenario, he's adjusting very well to his skill set, and they complement each other perfectly. Another best case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that he continues to be Gonzaga's best perimeter defender. I think the honor actually is probably going to go to Stromer or Innocente in terms of like the talent as a perimeter defender, but among players who are consistently playing, who are starting or playing big minutes, Nolan Hickman is the guy who is frustrating opposing guards. He's in their grill. He's getting over screens adequately. He's making life difficult for opposing guards. And then the best case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that he is a leader, a fourth-year guy. Him and Gregg are the players who've been in this system the longest. Hickman is not just a steadying presence and calm, cool, collected, but he's a leader. He's mentoring players. He's helping the young guys develop. Again, Battle and Ajayi are in their final year of college basketball eligibility. They don't need to develop necessarily, but he's helping them get up to speed in the system, get ready for everything that's coming their way so that Gonzaga doesn't avoid those issues we saw from them last year. And then he is also helping with the development of guys like Dusty Stromer and Emmanuel Innocente and Braden Smith. And again, those aren't things we'll necessarily tangibly see this season, but the best case scenario is that is happening and that he's kind of, paying it forward, as it were, and helping this team be better when he's gone. And then the best case scenario for Nolan Hickman, he's all WCC first team. He's a legitimate contender to be the WCC's player of the year. The worst case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that another shifting role leads to some regression for him offensively. Nolan Hickman's role has changed every single year. And this is the first year where it's not that different, but it will be a little bit different. Part of that depends on whether he's coming off the bench or starting. Obviously, if he's back coming off the bench, that's a pretty significant change from what his role was previously. But even so, he's going to be alongside another guard. Last year was pretty much 2 guards and then wings. Dusty Stromer is a guard of sorts, but he was a bigger guard. This year, if Hickman's playing alongside Battle, that's just a little bit different than what he's used to previously. And in a worst case scenario, the reduced playing time makes him stress and press, and he's trying to do too much. And that calm, cool, collected side of Hickman that we really value and need this year isn't really there. He's not that steady presence. He's not that clutch shooter. You can see he's trying to do too much. He's trying to make too much of an impact because he's not playing as many minutes. Maybe he's not feeling comfortable with the new role. The worst case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that the outside shooting, which has continued to improve every single year, regresses. It's not a terrible scenario if he shoots 41% again. That's pretty good. If he shoots exactly the same as he did last year on the same amount of attempts, you'd want to see improvement, but it's certainly not bad if he doesn't improve in that area. But the worst case scenario is that he gets worse and that he continues to be a high volume shooter, but he's not knocking them down at the same clip that he did last year. And he's not providing that incredibly valuable and needed floor spacing to this team. The worst case scenario for Nolan Hickman is he doesn't gel as well with Caleb Battle and or Michael Ajayi. It's hard to know exactly what would cause that, but a worst case scenario is there's just spacing issues, there's issues, communication issues, and you can just tell that there's not as much cohesion in the backcourt, and Hickman is in some way related to that, is involved in that being an issue for this team. I don't think it would be a full season issue. That's exceedingly rare, but it could be something that we see particularly early in the year. And then the worst case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that he's inconsistent. You just don't know what version you're getting every night. Some nights he goes out, he knocks down 5 threes. He's consistent. He's confident. He's leading the team to victory. Some nights he's completely not there. 0 of 4, 0 of 6. You don't even see him play as much in the second half. He's just not a big piece for this team. And then defensively, he gets bullied by bigger guards. It's something we've seen, and we saw it in that USC exhibition game, him and Nembhard. And he's just not as impactful of a defensive player. And on a team that is missing their best perimeter defender from last year in Anton Watson, Hickman is not able to be as impactful defensively as Gonzaga needs him to be for this team to be as good of a defensive team as they're going to need to be if they want to contend for a national championship. The worst case scenario for Nolan Hickman is that his playing time drops as the year goes on. maybe if he starts in the starting lineup, maybe he gets benched. That would be the worst case scenario. Or if he starts on the bench, he starts playing 28, 20, 30 minutes a game, and then it drops to 25, and then drops to 23, and Caleb Battle's playing more, and Mike Legiai's playing more at the 3, maybe even Dusty Stromer's playing a little bit more, and his career doesn't end on his best season. And that's just always a bummer. You don't like to see that for guys. And it would unfortunately validate a lot of people who have been screaming about their dislike for Nolan Hickman, the same people who dislike Josh Perkins, the same people who pick whoever the team's guard is and just say that's the problem with the team is so-and-so player. It would be validating for those folks if Nolan Hickman were to have a bit of a regression in his senior year. Let's talk about what we think is actually going to happen for Nolan Hickman in his final season in Spokane. We'll talk his expected role, expected production, plus his basketball future. All of that coming up here in just a second. But first, our friends over at 5 Hour Energy, they know that being a passionate fan, it's not just a hobby, it's a way of life. And it takes a lot of energy to power through all-day pregame parties, post-game celebrations, or an agonizing second overtime. That's why they've created the Stan the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like us. The fans who are the first in the kennel and who are the last to leave. We see you. And you know what's given us Zag fans feel this week? Opening night, a matchup against Baylor, the best opening night game Gonzaga has had in a very long time. And 5 Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate, ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. And that's why the limited edition Stan the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help keep you fueled throughout the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with a 5 Hour Energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, closing out the show with the rest of our Nolan Hickman season preview episode here. We talked very briefly about his history. We also talked about his best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season. Now let's talk about what we expect Nolan Hickman's final season in Spokane to look like. Nolan Hickman did not start against USC. Caleb Battle got the starting spot in that one. So it will be interesting to see what the starting lineup looks like when Gonzaga plays Baylor in that first game on November 4th. That's when we'll get the best sense of what this starting lineup is truly going to look like. But whether Nolan Hickman is starting or coming off the bench, I expect he's going to play close to 30 minutes per night. Probably more than 30 minutes per night, but we'll see. Last year he played 35 minutes per night. But again, last year the Zags did not have Caleb Battle. They had Luka Krajinovic, and for half the season, they did not have Luka Krajinovic because he was dealing with a wrist injury. So I expect Nolan Hickman's playing time to drop. I don't really think Ryan Nembhard's is going to drop much. He was about the same last year, 35 minutes per game. But Gonzaga wants Ryan Nembhard to be the point guard. Nolan Hickman is kind of the backup point guard in a pinch, but they don't want him to play a lot of minutes there. So Nembhard's going to play a lot, and I think Battle's going to take minutes away from Hickman, away from Stromer, away from a few other guys as well. So I would expect Hickman in the 27 to 32 minute per game range, kind of depending on how he performs, depending on how Battle performs, some various other things in that area. But it's not going to look dramatically different. The playing time may drop a little bit, but I don't think that the performance, the statistics will be all that different. He was 14 points per game last year. It wouldn't surprise me if that ends up being his career high, but not because Hickman's going to regress this year, but he's going to get a few less touches. Ajayi and Battle are going to take more shots than we saw in the past. And again, if he's goes from playing 35 minutes to 28 minutes, it's hard to replicate the same amount of points per game. So I'm kind of projecting him in the 12 to 14 points per game range, 3-ish assists. I'm hoping we see a little bump. He was like 2.7 assists per game last year. So closer to 3 assists per game. Turnover numbers being around the same. I think he's 1.3 turnovers per game the last 2 seasons. So less than 1.5 turnovers per game, about 3 assists. 42% from 3 would be great. He was just a touch over 41% this last year. So if he can stay that level of efficiency, again, a player like Caleb Battle is going to command a lot of attention driving to the rim, should give Nolan Hickman a lot of open 3-point opportunities. So I think he's going to get a lot of good looks, and I think he's going to knock him down at a really high clip. I also think he's going to be a big part of Gonzaga's defense. Still have some concerns about this team defensively, particularly the size in the backcourt, but I will never question Nolan Hickman's tenacity on defense, his heart, his energy, his hustle, and I think he's going to utilize that to be a pest for opposing guards throughout the season. I expect Nolan Hickman will be an all WCC first teamer. I think second team is kind of the realistic worst case scenario. Yes, there's a possibility that Hickman is honorable mention and doesn't make the second team, but I think it's most likely that he's either first team or second team. And even if he's second team, I think some people are going to say, hey, he probably deserved to be on the first team. I think he's going to put up those kind of numbers. And if he comes off the bench, then he's going to be a strong candidate to be WC Sixth Man of the Year, if not the immediate odds-on favorite to win said award. What about the future for Nolan Hickman? Well, this is his final year of eligibility. We know that. He's kind of the first in that group of there's not really any mystery or confusion anymore. I'm really happy to not have to stare at Basketball Reference and be like, well, did they count that season? Is that a red shirt? That's the COVID year. So what does it mean? Or looking on rosters and seeing senior and being like, okay, does that mean that they have more eligibility or not? Nolan Hickman's kind of in that group of like, nope, they started the year after the COVID eligibility. He played 3 years. This is his 4th year. He's done after this. There's no mystery. There's no surprise. We just know the deal with Nolan Hickman. So I think he's a player that obviously we'll see how this year goes, and he certainly can flip some of the narrative, but I fear that he will probably never get the recognition that he deserves. If he comes out and has the season I expect him to have, 12 to 14 points per game, 42% from 3 assists, and Gonzaga has a similar season. They go to the Sweet 16, they go to the Elite Eight, maybe. Obviously, if they win a championship, everybody's legacy is a little bit different, but if they have a really good year and don't get to the championship, Nolan Hickman's a player that I think people will remember not as much as they should. Let's put it that way. It's something that I could see being the case of 5 years from now. Like, oh, you remember Nolan Hickman the same way we say, oh, remember Josh Perkins? And people say, oh, yeah, he was pretty good, or he was all right, or oh, he really frustrated me. And it's like, he was actually really good and didn't quite get the recognition that I think a lot of people at the time thought that he deserved. And I could see that being the unfortunate future for Nolan Hickman. We'll see. He's also just an incredibly humble dude, a good leader, a good face of the program, a charitable guy. He's got a give back foundation for kids in Seattle. I think there's a lot of really great things about Nolan Hickman, and I'll be sad when his Gonzaga basketball career is over, but excited to see what he's got in store for us for his final season. And then, of course, as we do with all of these, we always talk about the NBA future for these guys. I think there's a couple of players on this team that I do think will be NBA players, but most of them are not the players that are going to play big minutes for this team. And Hickman is kind of in that latter category where I think he's going to be one of their best players, but he's a 6'3" combo guard. And that's just not, the NBA does not really have a spot for those guys. Undersized twos are a dime a dozen. And while Nolan Hickman is a good basketball player, I don't see an NBA future for him based on his frame. And if you're going to be a 6'3" player in the NBA, you have to be an elite point guard. And Nolan Hickman is not an elite point guard. He is a very good shooter. He is a good off guard, but off guards at his size aren't really sticking in the league. You look at Gonzaga's other great undersized two guards in recent past, Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton. Those are two very recent examples, of course. Josh Perkins is more of a point guard, but he, kind of similar category for him. There's obviously others as well, but it's hard to make it. It's hard to make it at that spot. And I just don't see Hickman being a guy who gets a ton of NBA attention for those reasons. I could see him sticking in the G League like Ryan Woolridge has, and like Malachi Smith and Admon Gilder are both in the G League right now. Rasir Bolton's killing it overseas. So I could see him being a G League guy. I could see him going overseas if he chooses to do that, if he wants to do that. But I don't see him being an NBA player, unfortunately, just based on what the modern NBA is wanting out of their guards and what he can't really do a whole lot about, which is his height and just overall frame. It's going to wrap it up for me today. We got one more show before the big season begins. We're going to do some bold predictions for you on Friday. And then Monday, we're previewing that big game against Baylor. And then we are fully into the season. I cannot wait to be talking about real, actual games that count in the standings very, very soon here on Locked On Zags. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On Zags Discord channel. Free to join, and there's a link in the show notes if you haven't done so yet. Going to be a lot of fun conversations throughout the games this season there, so definitely check that out. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.